Welcome to Trashmagination, a podcast about reimagining trash. I'm Carla Brown. In today's episode, we'll talk about how to weave a rug from a recycled t-shirt. There are lots of ways to make a rug from a recycled t-shirt, including crocheting, twining, rug hooking, latch hooking, and knitting. But I'm going to talk about weaving rugs. When I made a rug this month, I posted videos and photos on Instagram and Facebook. And a few people wrote in the comments that they wished they could make one too. So I decided this episode will tell you how to do it, since this is a very accessible creative reuse craft. First, you need to make yarn from recycled t-shirts. I have reviewed many videos about this, and I will share my favorite, which is by Mindful Makers. The first half of this video is about how to tie-dye your t-shirt to make very colorful yarn. And then at about the 35-minute mark, there is a demonstration of how to make the t-shirt yarn. When I first started making t-shirt yarn, I would cut my strips too thin, and the yarn was not hearty enough. Also, I used scissors, which was quite tedious. I recently changed the blade on my rotary cutter to make my t-shirt yarn go much faster. And wow, it made such a huge difference. I can make t-shirt yarn really fast now. So should you wash your t-shirts before you weave them? Well, normally I'm weaving secondhand t-shirts that have been washed plenty of times. However, for the rug I just made, I used t-shirts that had not been washed. They were made by an organization that had changed its logo, and so they no longer wanted that old logo in circulation. I could have washed the t-shirts before using them, but I decided to see if it might work just fine without washing them. And the result was that the whole rug shrank a bit when I washed it after the fact. And I saw that actually as a benefit because it made the rug nice and dense. My rug actually shrank by about 2 inches on the short size and 5 inches on the long side. And because I used the same new unwashed t-shirt fabric throughout the whole rug, it all shrank evenly. So I think the key is if you are going to use new unwashed t-shirts, then you should use that entirely through the whole rug. Or if you're going to use secondhand, use all secondhand washed t-shirts. The next thing you need in order to weave t-shirts is a loom. Now, I have a super cool loom that my husband made for me in 2015. He had not done a lot of carpentry before this, but he had a lot of fun making this loom. It's called a story loom, and it was designed by Susan Barrett Merrill and her husband Richard Merrill from Weaving a Life. And I took a weaving class from Susan and learned about the loom through her. So they sell the pattern for this loom on their website. So my husband built it at our local community woodshop where you pay $10 and you get access to all these huge woodworking tools that we would never have in our small home. Plus, there is a woodshop supervisor who can lend their expertise if that person is not too busy. But the good news is that you don't have to build a huge wooden loom to weave a rug from recycled t-shirts. You can just go to a thrift shop and buy a big picture frame. I recommend a wonderful video series by Annabelle Wrigley that she made with Creative Bug, and these are available for free on YouTube. Video 1 is about setting up your loom. So Annabelle is a fiber artist who lives in Virginia, not too far from me, and she makes her loom in the video by removing the canvas from a painting canvas. And in your video, you can see that she is just using a large rectangular wooden frame. There are, of course, commercially available looms. They tend to be a bit small for making a floor rug, but you can look and buy those as well. So next you need to put a warp on your loom. So here's some important weaving jargon. The threads that go up and down are called the warp. The threads that go side to side, back and forth, are called the weft. You can see a video on my social media where I am putting on my recycled t-shirt warp in a time-lapse video. And since it's a time-lapse, it looks like I'm doing it at super speed. But the truth is, I am putting it on pretty quickly. It takes me less than 5 minutes to put on my warp. And the main reason why I can put it on so fast is because my husband put screws at the top and bottom of my loom so I could quickly wrap the warp threads. If you are using a wooden frame and you don't want to add screws or nails along the top and the bottom, you can just tie off the warp threads at the top and the bottom. And that's what my mom did when she did her first weaving, and I'll share photos of how she did that. And if you're wondering how much t-shirt yarn it takes to make a warp, well, you can look at that video and you can see how big my frame is. It's going to end up making a rug that is 2 feet by 3 feet. And it took 2 XXL t-shirts or 3 large t-shirts worth of t-shirt yarn to make that warp. So next you're going to start weaving back and forth. This is called putting on the weft. And I do this by just picking up every second string with my fingers. And then I'll pick up maybe 6 or 8 of these, and then I will pass my ball of t-shirt yarn under those threads. When you pull out every second string, the gap that you create is called the shed. So I loosely place my yarn in the shed, and I then continue across the row, and I use my fingers, or I actually use a small rug hooking hook to push the yarn down so that it looks flat. Now, there are some important tricks to this part of the weaving. The biggest challenge with making a weaving of this size is that you have a tendency to pull too tightly on the yarn when you make the turn to do the next row. And when you do that, your rug starts getting skinnier and skinnier, and it is no longer a rectangle, and this is not a good rug. So the way I avoid this is that I tie a very skinny dowel, a stick, to my 2 outer warp threads on each side, and that gives me a visual indicator of where I want the rug to actually end. And when I finish a row, I actually wrap my t-shirt yarn around that dowel, and that helps me keep the rug rectangular. Another tip is to keep a tape measure nearby and to measure your rug often to make sure that it's not getting skinnier as you weave. Now, this is a skill that takes practice. I'm still working on it, and sometimes when I'm really excited, my rug starts getting skinnier, and I have to take out the last 5 or 10 rows that I just did. But to summarize, do not pull your yarn too tight when you finish one row and start the next. Another way to avoid this problem is using a technique called bubbling. When you put in your weft thread, you don't just pull it straight across. It needs to have some slack. So the way you achieve that is you place your yarn in kind of an arcing motion, sort of like little tiny rainbows. And you push it down with all that extra yarn in there, and that gives it the slack so that the rug doesn't pull too tight. Now, you might be wondering, do I really have to pick up every second thread one at a time by hand? That looks super tedious. Isn't there some kind of tool that will make this go faster? And the answer is yes, of course there is. There are these systems called shed systems. And the shed, as I said before, is that space which is created when you pull out every second thread. There are so many kinds of shed systems all these different smart weavers have invented, and I will link to a blog about it so you can compare. I would say that the least complicated is called the rotating heddle bar. And the way it works is when you turn the bar in one direction, it opens the first shed. And then when you turn the bar in the other direction, it opens the second shed, and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And rotating heddle bars are not very expensive. You can look on Etsy, for example, and they might be only like $15 or $25. There are also other kinds of looms that are much more involved than a simple picture frame. This method of weaving that I'm talking about here on a simple frame is called tapestry weaving, and it requires the least amount of equipment. I also have a floor loom where you're actually sitting down while you do the weaving and you step on petals on the floor and it opens the shed for you. But getting the warp on a floor loom, it usually takes me at least 3, 4, 5 hours, not 10 minutes. And the reason why it takes so long is because I have to feed each warp thread through these little tiny pieces of metal called heddles, which lift and lower the threads and create the shed. And the heddles on my floor loom are actually too small for my t-shirt yarn even to fit in. So I cannot make a t-shirt rug where the warp is made from t-shirt yarn. I could do it from regular thread. And that would look cool. It would be a way of doing it. And I have done it that way in the past. But in this case, I wanted the warp and the weft threads to be made from t-shirt yarn. And so that's why I did a tapestry weaving method. I also felt like when I did it this way that the final rug would be much stronger. The other reason why I don't use any more complicated technology, even a rotating heddle bar, is because I find weaving very soothing and relaxing. And I actually like that it's kind of meditative to pull out every second thread. I'm doing it on purpose. If you're in a rush, this might not be the best option for you, but if you're looking for something that'll make you feel very relaxed, then you might consider it. Now, my rug was entirely made from white t-shirt yarn, and it was as simple as you can get. If you wanted to have a pattern in your rug, it is more complicated, of course. I recommend that you watch Annabelle Wrigley's video, part 4, where she demonstrates how she adds a pattern to a rug. One way that people plan their pattern in advance is to draw it on a large piece of paper, like as big as their final rug is going to be, and then they hang the paper behind the warp. And the lines of that pattern are now visible through the warp, and that can help you remember when you need to change colors. Or another technique, if you just want to have a shape in the middle of your rug, like a circle or a heart or whatever, is that you can cut out a piece of paper in that shape, and then you actually weave it into place like through the warp threads, and it'll just hang out there, and then you can weave around it. And then when you're done weaving around it, you take out the paper and you weave the inside of it. And there's a really great video about this that I'll link to in the show notes by Spruce and Linen. So the last step is that I need to finish my rug. So once my rug was a good size, the way I finished it was that I snipped every second warp loop and I tied them off with a double knot. And I did that along the top and along the bottom of the rug. And then I went back and I did every second loop again until there were very few warp threads actually holding the rug on the loom. And then finally I cut the last few, took it off the loom and tied them off. And I was just using a simple double knot. And the t-shirt yarn made a very cute fringe. After that, I washed and dried my rug. And I was really pleased to see that even when I washed and dried it, it still lay completely flat. I did give it a little ironing, but it looks great. And that's one reason why these recycled t-shirt rugs are so practical. Not only do they use up extra t-shirts, but they are easy to wash. So thank you for listening to this episode. If you're looking for additional inspiration, I have talked about weaving and creative reuse of t-shirts in quite a few past Trashmagination episodes. For example, in episode 3, that was really early on, I talked about weaving plastic bags. In episode 13, I talked about trash fashion, and for that episode, I showed how I made some dresses by weaving plastic bags on my tapestry loom. And then episode 41 was all about many ways to creatively reuse t-shirts, many ways beyond weaving. So if weaving sounds like maybe not your thing, you can get lots of ideas in that episode. I also wrote a series of blogs when I was first learning how to use my floor loom, and those are very popular on my website. And so if you're just starting out learning how to use a floor loom, you can check on those. I took photos of every single step. And in fact, my weaving teacher at the time says she was going to use them to teach her future students. One of the first things I wove on my floor loom was tie-dye t-shirts. So let me know if you have ever woven a recycled t-shirt rug. You can reach me at trashmagination@gmail.com. And until next time, may you see recycled t-shirts as a source of woven rugs in your life.